Hey guys, tonight I am going to take you somewhere you have never been, and somewhere you would not want to stay. We are going to the year 536, and I should tell you, right at the outset, so there are no surprises in the dark, that 536 has a reputation. Historians have called it the worst year in all of human history to be alive. Not the worst year of a war, not the worst year of a plague, the worst year, full stop, out of all the thousands of years that people have lived and worked and slept on this earth. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere, and I find it oddly comforting to imagine all of us scattered around the world and lying in the dark listening. Also, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries, through the long, quiet, dark 1500 years, to a morning in early spring, when someone very like you opened their eyes and looked up at a sky that was wrong. Now here is the thing about 536. For nearly 1500 years, nobody knew what had happened. People lived through it and wrote down what they saw, and what they saw made no sense at all. The sun went out. Not all at once, not in an eclipse that passed in an hour, but slowly, and then it stayed out, dim and blue and cold, for 18 months. And then the writers died, and the centuries rolled on, and their strange reports sat in old books like a locked room with no key. And then, quite recently, in our own lifetimes, a group of scientists went and drilled a long tube of ice out of a glacier in the Alps, and found the key frozen inside it, and unlocked the whole thing. You wake, and something is off, and you cannot say what. The light is the first thing. It is coming through the gap in the shutters, but it is coming in wrong. It is thin, it is grey, it has no gold in it. It is the light of very early morning, the light of not quite dawn, except that you can hear the birds, and you can hear the household stirring, and by the sound of it the morning is well along. You lie there for a moment in the strange grey, and try to work it out. Cloud, probably. A heavy sky. It happens. You get up. You go out. And you stop in the doorway, because the sky is not cloudy. There is no cloud. There is no storm coming. The sky is clear, in the sense that there is nothing in it, and yet it is not blue, and it is not bright. It is a kind of flat, dull, whitish nothing, like a bowl of dirty milk turned over the world. And there, in the middle of it, is the sun. You can look at it. That is the first genuinely frightening thing, and you notice it before you understand it. You can look straight at the sun, easily, without flinching, without your eyes watering, the way you can look at the moon. It sits there, pale and round and cold, giving no glare and casting no dazzle, a coin of dull silver where the sun should be. You raise your hand, without quite meaning to, and hold it out in front of you, and there is no shadow, or there is a shadow, but it is so faint, so soft-edged, so barely there, that it is hardly a shadow at all. Your own body is not blocking the light, because the light is not coming from anywhere in particular anymore. It is just there, dim and even and everywhere, like the light inside a fog, except there is no fog on the ground. The fog is up there. The fog is the sky, and it is cold, not the sharp, honest cold of a winter morning, which you know and can dress for, but a wrong cold, a cold that should not be here, because it is spring, and the buds are out, and the fields are turned and waiting, and yet the air on your face is the air of February. You stand in your doorway and you look up at a sun you can stare at, and you feel the cold that should not be, and somewhere low down in you a very old animal part of your brain says quietly, in a voice you have never heard it used before. This is not normal. That is where we begin. That is the morning. It really happened to real people all across the world, and none of them knew what it was, and it did not go away. Let that strange grey morning and that sun you could look at settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the question of who you are, standing in that doorway, and what your life looked like before the sky went wrong. Let us decide who you are, since you are going to be living through this year, and it will be easier if we know. You are not an emperor, and you are not a bishop, and you are not a general, because the odds are enormously against it, and because those people have already been written about quite enough. You are an ordinary person. Let us say you are a farmer, because in this world, almost everybody is a farmer. You live in a small village of a few families, somewhere in the wide middle of things, and it does not much matter where, because this is going to happen almost everywhere. Let us put you in Europe, in a valley with a stream and a wood and a few fields, and a scatter of low houses with thatched roofs and smoke leaking through them. You are, let us say, 30. You have a family. You have a house that you did not build but that your father helped build, and a field that you did not clear but that your grandfather cleared. You have some animals, a few cattle perhaps, some pigs, some chickens that wander where they like. You have neighbours whose names you have known since before you could talk, and there is no one for a day's walk in any direction who is a stranger to you. And here is the important thing to understand about your life, the thing that will matter more than anything else in the year to come. Your entire existence runs on the sun, not in a poetic way, in a completely literal and mechanical way. The sun makes the grain grow. The grain becomes the bread. The bread is the food. There is no other food, not really. There is a little meat, on feast days, and some cheese, and whatever the woods and the stream will give you. But the great bulk of what keeps you and your children alive is grain, and grain is sunlight, patiently converted into something you can eat. You are, in the plainest terms, a machine for turning sunshine into people, and so is everyone you have ever met, and so is the entire world. You have no reserve. This is the other thing. You have a store from last year's harvest, and it is meant to last exactly until this year's harvest comes in, and it does, most years. And in the bad years you tighten your belt and you make it, just. There is no great warehouse over the hill with a year's spare food in it. There is no ship coming with grain from a place that had better weather. There is this year's sun and this year's crop, and that is the whole of the arrangement, and it has worked for every single one of the thousands of years that people have farmed this valley. So when you stand in your doorway on that grey morning and look up at a sun with no strength in it, you are not looking at a curiosity. You are not looking at strange weather. You are looking, though you do not know it yet, at the engine of your life running down. Everything you have, and everyone you love, is downstream of that pale silver coin in the sky, and it has gone dim, and nobody knows why, and it is not coming back for 18 months. Let that ordinary life, the field and the grain and the family, and the total dependence on the sun, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the men who wrote it down, the few voices from that year that have come to us across all the centuries between. The remarkable thing, the thing that makes this whole story possible, is that some people wrote it down, and their words survived. And we can read them tonight, 1500 years later, and hear, faint but perfectly clear, the sound of someone trying to describe something they have no words for. The first is a man named Procopius. He is a Byzantine historian, a serious professional writer, a man attached to the great military campaigns of his age, and he is not given to hysteria. He is the sort of writer who is careful and a bit dry, and likes to get his facts right. And in his account of the wars, in the middle of the ordinary business of who fought whom and where, he stops, and he writes that during this year a most dread portent took place, and then he tries to say what it was. He says that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He says it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, because the beams it shed were not clear. Read that again slowly, and hear what he is actually saying. Like the moon. During the whole year, he is a careful man reaching for the only comparison he has. And the only comparison he has is the moon, because that is the only thing he has ever seen in the sky that you can look at without pain. And he does not say for a day, he does not say for an hour, he says the whole year. The second voice is a Roman statesman named Cassiodorus, and he is writing a couple of years later, and he is even more precise, and somehow that makes it worse. He describes a sun whose rays are weak, and which has taken on a strange bluish colour. He describes noon with no shadows on the ground. He describes the heat of the sun as feeble. He describes the moon at its full as being empty of splendour, which is a phrase I find so beautiful and so sad that I have never quite got over it. And then he sums up the whole thing in one line that has echoed down the centuries, in which he speaks of a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. A winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. That is a whole year, described in 10 words by a man watching the seasons themselves stop working. And they are not alone. From Ireland, the annals record a failure of bread, and record it not for 1 year, but for several running. From the Middle East, the same dense fog. From China, imperial records describe yellow dust falling like snow, and snow in the middle of summer, which in some places killed the crops outright. All these people, thousands of miles apart, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, knowing nothing whatever of each other, all looked up in the same year and wrote down the same impossible thing. The sun has gone wrong. And none of them, not one, had the faintest idea why. Let those old, careful voices, reaching for the words and not finding them, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what it was actually like to live underneath that sky, day after day, as the strangeness stopped being news and started being life. The first week, it is a wonder. The second week, it is a worry. By the second month, it is simply the world. This is a thing people forget about catastrophes, and it is worth sitting with tonight, because it is one of the more human details in the whole story. Nothing stays astonishing. You cannot hold astonishment for 18 months. The human mind will not do it. It gets tired, and it adjusts, and the impossible slowly turns into the ordinary, and then into the background, and then into the thing you barely mention. So picture the shape of it. In those first days, you and your neighbours stand out in the road and stare up and talk about nothing else. Someone says it is a sign. Someone says it will pass by the new moon. Someone remembers a story their grandmother told about a dark day, long ago, that lifted after a week. You all agree it is strange. You all keep looking up. Then a month goes by, and you are still looking up, but less. Then 2 months, and you look up mainly out of habit, checking, the way you might check a wound to see if it is healing. It is not healing. Then 3 months, and you have stopped remarking on it, because what is there to say? The sky is dim. The sky has been dim for 3 months. Everyone knows the sky is dim. It is the least useful piece of news in the entire valley. And the children, and this is the detail that gets me, the children stop finding it strange at all. The small ones, the ones who were 3 or 4 when it started, will grow into it. To them, the pale sun is just the sun. The blue light is just light. Nobody has to explain to them that this is wrong, because they do not have a right to compare it to. For a whole cohort of children across half the world, this dim and shadowless world simply is the world, and the bright one is something the old people go on about. But you notice things all through those months. You notice that the shadows never come back properly, that you cannot tell the hour by them any more. that the sundial in the town has become a piece of decoration. You notice that the colours have gone. Everything is the same washed grey-green, the leaves and the water and the faces of your friends, and you find yourself, on the rare day when the veil thins a little and a shaft of proper yellow light comes down, standing quite still in it like an animal, with your face turned up, not saying anything, just standing there in the light for as long as it lasts. That is what those 18 months are like. Not screaming, not madness, just a slow, grinding, low-grade wrongness, going on and on and on, and the world quietly getting used to it, because the world always quietly gets used to it, and because there is nothing else to do. Let that long grey adjusting, and the children who never knew a brighter sun, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a small and strange consequence that almost nobody thinks about, which is what happens to time itself when the shadows go. Here is a small thing that I find quietly astonishing, and that almost never gets mentioned. When the shadows went, the clocks went with them. Think about how a person in the 6th century knows what time it is. They do not have a watch. They do not have a phone. They do not have a mechanical clock, because mechanical clocks will not be invented for another 700 years or so. What they have is the sun, and the shadow it throws, and that is essentially the entire technology of timekeeping for the whole of the ancient world. In the towns there are sundials, and they are not decorations, they are the town clock. That is how you know when to open, when to meet, when the market starts, when the hour of prayer has come. In the countryside, you do not even need a dial, because you have the world. You look at the length of your own shadow, or the shadow of a tree you have known your whole life, and you know roughly what hour it is, the way you know your own hands. Every farmer in history has been able to look at the ground and tell the time. And then the shadows go soft, and then they go away. Cassiodorus is very precise about this, and it is one of the eeriest lines in all his writing. He describes noon with no shadows on the ground. Not short shadows, no shadows, because the light was no longer coming from a point in the sky, it was coming from the entire sky at once, scattered and diffused through that high veil of droplets, arriving from everywhere and therefore casting nothing. So the sundial in the town square becomes an ornament, a carved stone with lines on it that mean nothing anymore, standing in the middle of the market like a joke nobody is laughing at. And out in the fields, the farmer looks down at the ground at what feels like noon, and cannot tell whether it is 9 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, and cannot tell how long is left before dark, and has to guess. It is such a small thing next to a failed harvest. Nobody starved because they could not read a sundial. But I keep thinking about how deeply strange it must have been, in a way that goes underneath the fear and into something more disorienting. Time itself had come loose. The day no longer had a visible shape. You could not point at the ground and say, "There, that is where we are." All the ordinary structure that the sun draws on the world all day long, the moving of the shadow across the yard, the lengthening in the afternoon, the way the light comes through a particular window at a particular hour, and always has, all of it simply stopped, and the day became a grey uniform smear, from a dim morning to a dim evening, with nothing to mark the middle. We are so used to time coming from a machine that we forget it used to come from the sky. Those people did not lose a convenience. They lost a fundamental piece of how the world is built, one they had never once thought about, because who thinks about shadows? Shadows are simply there, until they are not. And when the light finally came back, 18 months later, one of the first things that would have returned, before the warmth, before the harvest, was that. The shadow, back on the ground, moving again, telling the hour. The world starting to keep time again. Let those missing hours, and the sundial standing useless in the square, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the seasons themselves, and to what happened when spring arrived and did not do the one thing spring is for. Spring comes, on the calendar. That is all it does. The date arrives. The saints' days that mark the turning of the year go past. The old people who know the signs go out and look at the hedges and come back frowning, because the buds are late. The buds are very late. And when they do come, they come thin and hesitant, and some of them do not come at all. You do what you have always done, because what else is there? You go out to the field and you turn the earth and you put the seed in. This is the oldest and most hopeful act there is, and you have done it every year of your life, and your father did it, and his father, and the act carries with it a promise that has always been kept. You put the seed in the cold ground in the grey, and the sun comes back, and the warmth builds, and the green comes up, and the promise is kept. The promise is not kept, the seed goes in. And then you wait, and the days go by, and the ground stays cold. Not frozen most days, just cold, wrong cold, a cold that will not lift. And the green, when it comes up pale and slow and low, and stalls. It does not fail dramatically. There is no fire, no flood, nothing you could point to and name as the disaster. It simply does not grow. It sits there in the field, a few inches high, the colour of an old man's hair, week after week, and does not put on height, and does not thicken, and does not do the thing that green things do. And Cassiodorus, far away, writing in his careful Latin, will put it perfectly, in that line we heard already. A spring without mildness. That is exactly it. Not a spring of storms and disaster. A spring with the mildness taken out of it. A spring with its heart removed, going through the motions of a spring while doing none of the work. You walk your field in the evening in that dull blue light, and you look at your poor thin crop, and you do the arithmetic that every farmer in history has done in the same walk. How much is here? How much do we need? What is in the store? How long can we stretch it? And the numbers do not work. They do not work by a lot. And you walk back to the house and you do not say very much. And your wife looks at your face and does not ask, because she already walked the field this morning and did the same arithmetic and got the same answer. Here is the part that would frighten you most, though, if you were really standing there, and it is not the hunger, because the hunger is still months away. It is the not knowing. If this were a drought, you would know it was a drought, and you would know that droughts break. If this were a hard winter, you would know it was a hard winter, and hard winters end. But there is no name for this. Nobody has ever seen this. There is no old man in the village who remembers the last time, because there was no last time. There is no story about how it ended, because there is no story about it at all. It is simply the sun going out, for reasons nobody knows, with no promise anywhere that it will ever come back on. Let that pale field and that broken promise settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the summer, which is meant to be the answer to every hard spring, and which that year came without any heat in it at all. Summer is the answer. That is what summer is for. Every hard spring in the history of farming has been survived on the strength of a simple faith, which is that the summer is coming, and the summer will fix it. The sun will climb, and the heat will build, and the late crop will race to catch up, and it will be a thin year, but it will be a year, and you will get through. So you wait for summer, and the days lengthen, because the days do not care what is in the sky. The earth keeps turning and tilting exactly as it always has, and the sun climbs higher and stays up longer, and it makes no difference at all, because the light is still coming through that veil, and the veil does not care how high the sun is. The heat arrives at the top of the sky and is turned back, and what filters down to your field is the same thin blue nothing it has been since the spring. Cassiodorus, again, in his 10 words, a summer without heat, not a cool summer, not a disappointing summer, a summer with the heat simply absent from it, a summer that is a summer only in the sense that the calendar says so. Across the world, in China, the imperial records tell of snow falling in the summer months. Think about that for a moment as you lie there warm. Somebody in the 6th century, in a place where summer is reliably hot, walked outside in the middle of the year and watched snow come down out of the sky onto crops that were trying to ripen, and it killed them where they stood. Somebody else, in the same country, recorded a strange yellow dust that fell like snow, that you could gather up in your hands by the fistful. They did not know it, but they were describing ash and dust from something enormous that had happened on the other side of the world, drifting down onto their fields. In Europe, the tree rings tell us what the writers did not have to. Trees keep a diary, and they keep it honestly, because a tree cannot lie about how much it grew. In a good warm year with plenty of light, a tree lays down a fat, comfortable ring. In a cold year with no sun, it lays down a thin, miserable one. And when scientists in our own age went and looked at the rings from these years, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. The summers around this time were among the coldest in 2,000 years. The rings are thin. Some of them show frost damage in the middle of summer, which is a tree's way of writing down, in its own patient wood, that something impossible happened here. The whole decade that follows becomes the coldest stretch in 2 millennia. So the summer comes, and does nothing, and passes. And now you are in real trouble, and you know it, and so does everyone, because the harvest is coming and there is nothing to harvest. You will go out with your sickle at the proper time, because that is what you do, and you will cut what is there, and what is there will be perhaps a third of what should be, perhaps less. Thin stuff, poor stuff, light in the hand, and you will thresh it and store it and look at the pile, and know, without needing to say it out loud, that the pile is not big enough to get you to the next harvest, and that the next harvest is a year away, and that the sky is still grey. Let that summer without heat, and the snow falling on the ripening fields of China, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the plainest and most terrible sentence in the whole story, 4 words written down by monks in Ireland. In Ireland, in the old annals, the year is recorded with the economy that only monks and accountants ever really achieve. They wrote of a failure of bread, and they wrote it not for 1 year alone, but for a run of years together, from 536 through to 539. A failure of bread. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is doing an enormous amount of work in a very small space. It does not say famine, though it means famine. It does not say hunger or death or suffering. It says that the bread failed. It is a technical note, an entry in a ledger, the way you or I might write down that the car would not start. And it covers, in 4 words, several years of a whole island's people slowly running out of the only thing they had to eat. That is the 6th century for you. That is how these people wrote. They were not being cold, they were being practical, and they were writing for other practical people who did not need it explained, because everyone reading it would know precisely what a failure of bread meant in their stomachs, without any elaboration at all. And I am not going to elaborate either, tonight, and here is why. I promised you at the start that this would not be a horror story, and I meant it. You know what hunger does. You do not need me to walk you through it in the dark at bedtime, and I am not going to. So let us do this the way the monks did it. Let us note the fact and respect it, and move on, and let the 4 words carry their own weight without me piling anything on top. What I will tell you is the shape of it, because the shape is where the interest is. A famine like this does not arrive with a bang. It arrives as a slow accounting. First you eat less of the good food, then you eat the food you would normally save for the animals. Then you eat the animals themselves, and this is a bigger moment than it sounds, because the animals are not food. The animals are the machinery. They are next year's ploughing, and next year's milk, and next year's wool, and to eat them is to eat your own future to stay alive in the present. Then you eat the seed corn, which is the last and worst step, because the seed corn is next year's crop, and when it is gone, The future is genuinely gone with it. And all through this, the sky is grey, and the sun is a coin, and nobody knows why. There is something else worth saying, and it is a gentle thing. People helped each other. That does not always come through in the grand accounts, which tend to notice emperors and battles, but it is true, and it is well attested across history. Villages shared, monasteries opened their stores, neighbours who had a little gave to neighbours who had none, often knowing perfectly well that it might cost them later. Human beings, faced with a failing world, mostly do not turn into animals. They mostly turn toward each other. That is one of the quieter findings of history, and it is worth holding on to tonight, because it is true, and because it is kind, and because it is exactly the sort of thing to fall asleep believing. Let those 4 words, and the long patient hunger behind them, and the neighbours sharing what they had, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the great question that hung over all of it, the question every single person in that year was asking. Why? You want to know why? Of course you do. It is the first thing any human being wants when something goes wrong, before food, before help, before anything. Why? What is this? What did it? And in 536 there is no answer, and there is not going to be one, not for 1500 years. So you do what people have always done in the absence of an answer, which is that you build one. The obvious explanation, the one nearly everybody reaches for, is that this is aimed at you. Not you personally, but you collectively. All of you. The people. The sky has gone dark, and skies do not simply go dark. So somebody has done this, and the only somebody big enough to do it is whatever god or gods you happen to believe in. And if a god has darkened the sun, then a god is angry. And if a god is angry, then somebody has done something wrong. You can see how quickly this goes somewhere unpleasant. Across the darkened world, in every faith and every language, people came to more or less the same conclusion, that this was a punishment. There is a story from an Egyptian city, later, during the plague years, in which a weeping child is told, essentially, that this suffering is the payment for sin. That was the mood. Not confusion exactly, but conviction. A settled, grim certainty that the world was being made to pay, and that it must have deserved it. And this is where I want to be careful with you, because it would be very easy to be smug about it, and being smug about the 6th century is both cheap and unfair. They were not stupid. They were not superstitious in the way we like to imagine, all wild eyes and gibbering. They were doing exactly what we do. They had an enormous, frightening, unexplained event, and they ran it through the best model of the world they had, and the model gave them an answer, and they believed the answer, because what else do you do with an answer? Their model happened to feature an interventionist heaven. Ours happens to feature stratospheric sulfate aerosols. In 1500 years, someone may find our model quaint too, and in one specific way, they were closer to right than they could possibly have known. They had concluded that the sky itself had been reached into and altered by an enormous force from far away, that something had come between the earth and the sun, and that the whole world was suffering the consequence of one single distant event. That is, if you strip out the theology and keep the mechanism almost exactly correct. Something enormous and far away had reached up into the sky and put something between them and the sun and darkened the whole world. They were wrong about who, they were right about what. Let that great unanswered question, and the answers people built to fill it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the north, to a cold place where people did something extraordinary and rather touching in their desperation to get the sun back. In Scandinavia, they buried their gold. This is one of my favourite details in the whole of this story, and one of the saddest, and it comes to us not from any book but from the ground itself. Archaeologists working in Norway and Sweden and Denmark kept finding hoards. Gold, serious gold, not the odd dropped coin, but great deliberate deposits of it, rings and bracteates and ornaments and worked treasure, the accumulated wealth of the powerful, put into the earth and into the bogs, and never taken out again. And when they dated these hoards, a striking number of them clustered around exactly this period, the middle of the 6th century, the end of what is called the migration period. Now, people bury treasure for all sorts of reasons, and archaeologists argue about this, and I want to be honest with you that this is an interpretation rather than a certainty. But the leading explanation, and the one that most people who study it find persuasive, is heartbreaking in its simplicity. They were paying for the sun. Think about how this must have looked from inside their world. The gods have taken the sun away. The gods are angry, or the gods are being overpowered by something, and either way the sun is going and the crops are failing and the world is ending. What do? You give the gods something. You give them the best thing you have. And what is the best thing you have? It is gold. It is the shining stuff, the bright stuff, the metal that looks like sunlight made solid. You take the most sun-colored thing in your possession, the gold you have gathered and fought for and treasured, and you give it back to the powers, and you ask them, please, take this, take all of it, and give us the light again. And these were not token offerings. The hoards are substantial. People were not hedging. They were emptying their treasuries into the bogs, throwing everything they had at the sky, because everything they had was worth nothing at all if the sun did not come back. There is a terrible clean logic to it. Gold cannot be eaten. If the world ends, gold is just heavy yellow rock. If the gold buys back the sun, it is the best trade anyone ever made. So into the ground it went. And of course it did not work, in the sense that the gold did nothing and the sun came back on its own schedule when the dust finally settled out of the stratosphere. But I find I cannot laugh at them even slightly. There is something almost unbearably human in it. The sky has broken, and you cannot fix the sky, so you take the most precious thing you own, and you offer it up, and you hope. That is not stupidity. That is love and terror and hope, all pressed together into one act, and then buried in a bog for 1,500 years until someone with a trowel came along and found it and worked out what it had meant. Let that buried gold, thrown into the earth to buy back the sunlight, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the story those same northern people would tell about this winter, a story so powerful that it outlived them by 1,000 years, and that you have almost certainly heard. There is a story in the north about the end of the world. Before the world ends, the story says, there comes a winter, not an ordinary winter, a great winter, a winter of winters, called the Fimble Winter. And what makes it terrible is not its severity but its length, because the Fimble Winter is 3 winters coming one after another with no summers in between. The snow drives in from all directions. The cold is unrelenting. The sun gives no comfort. And then, after the great winter, comes Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, when the world burns and ends. You know this story. Even if you have never read a word of Norse mythology, you know it, because it has soaked into everything, into books and films and games, one of the most famous apocalypse myths on Earth. The Great Winter before the end. And here is the thought that a number of researchers have had, looking at the ice and the tree rings and the buried gold, and it is a genuinely lovely piece of detective work. What if the Fimble Winter is not a myth at all? What if it is a memory? Because look at what happened. In Scandinavia, the effects of this event were savage. It is a marginal place for farming at the best of times, up near the northern limit of where grain will grow at all, and it lives on a thin margin of summer warmth. Take that warmth away for several years running, and the margin does not shrink, it vanishes. The evidence from the tree rings shows severe damage. Researchers there think the population may have collapsed catastrophically, that in parts of Norway and Sweden a huge portion of the people may have died, comparable to what the Black Death would do 800 years later. Farms went silent. Whole regions emptied. Places that had names stopped having anybody left to say them. Now imagine you are one of the survivors of that. Imagine your grandmother lived through it, and told your mother, and your mother told you, and you tell your children. What do you tell them? You tell them about the winter that came and did not leave. You tell them about the summers that did not arrive. You tell them about the sun that gave no warmth, and the people who died, and the world that very nearly ended. And you tell it, and it gets told again and again, and each time it is told it is polished a little, and shaped a little, and pushed a little further back into the realm of the sacred, until after enough centuries it is no longer a thing your grandmother's grandmother lived through. It is a thing the gods went through, at the beginning of the end of the world. That is the theory. That the Fimbul winter, the great winter before Ragnarok, is the year 536, and the years after it, remembered by people who could not write it down, carried in stories instead of books, passed hand to hand down the generations until it became myth. We cannot prove it. It may be wrong, but when you look at the myth and then look at the evidence and see how neatly the shape of the one sits inside the shape of the other, it is very hard not to feel the hair rise slightly on your arms. Let that great winter and the myth that may be a memory settle gently in the dark. We turn now away from the north and back to the wider world to see how far this thing reached, because it reached very much further than you might think. Here is the thing that makes 536 different from almost every other disaster in history. It was not somewhere, it was everywhere. Nearly every catastrophe you can name happened in a place. An earthquake flattens a city, and the next city is fine. A war ruins a country, and the country over the border carries on. A famine strikes a region, and grain comes in from a region that had rain. There is always an outside. There is always somewhere the disaster is not, and that somewhere is what saves you, because help comes from there, and food comes from there, and if it gets bad enough you can walk there. In 536, there was no outside. Follow the reports around the globe, and watch the thing close over the whole northern half of the world like a lid. In Constantinople, Procopius watches the sun go dim and stay dim. In Italy, Cassiodorus watches the shadows fail at noon. In Ireland, the monks write of bread failing, year after year. Across the Middle East, the same dense fog. In China, yellow dust falls like snow, and snow falls in summer, and the crops die where they stand. The dust and the sulphur went up into the stratosphere, which is the layer of the sky above the weather, where nothing washes out, and the winds run right around the planet, and it spread out into a veil that covered the entire hemisphere and hung there. So there was nowhere to walk to. There was no better valley over the hill. There was no ship coming from a country that had a good harvest, because there was no country that had a good harvest. Everyone was under the same lid at the same time. For maybe the only occasion in the whole of recorded history before the modern age, the entire civilized world had exactly the same problem on exactly the same day, and none of them knew that any of the others were having it. That is what I find most extraordinary, actually. The loneliness of it. A man in Ireland and a man in China looked up at the same dimmed sun in the same year and had the same fear and wrote the same words, and neither of them ever knew the other existed. They were sharing the largest experience of their lives with someone on the other side of the planet, and they died without knowing it, and it took us 1,500 years to put their two pieces of paper next to each other and realize they were describing the same afternoon. There is something in that which is almost tender. All those people scattered across the whole width of the world, each thinking their sky had personally broken, each building their own explanation, each burying their own gold or saying their own prayers, all of them looking up at one single event that none of them could see the shape of because they were standing inside it. It took the whole of human history since, and a drill and a glacier, to stand far enough back to see it whole. Let that veiled world, and all those separate people looking up at the same sky, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the years after, because 536 was not the end of it. It was only the beginning. Here is the detail that turns a catastrophe into an era, and it is the one most people do not know. 536 was not a one-off, it was the first punch, because in the year 540, just as the world was beginning to steady itself, just as the veil from the first event was finally thinning out of the sky, and the sun was starting to look like the sun again, and people were repairing and replanting and daring to breathe, it happened again. Another eruption, another veil, another blow, and the ice tells us this second one may have been even bigger than the first, driving temperatures down even further than 536 had. And then, in 547, it happened a third time. Sit with the cruelty of the timing. Not one disaster, 3, spaced out just far enough apart that each one arrives exactly when you have used up the last of your reserves recovering from the previous one. You survive 536 by eating your stores. You survive 537 and 538 and 539 by eating your animals and your seed corn, and by the charity of neighbours who have almost nothing themselves. And then, in 540, just as you are getting the first decent crop back into the ground, the sky closes over again. This is why historians talk about this period the way they do. This is why Michael McCormick, the Harvard historian who has done as much as anyone to bring this whole story to light, described it not merely as the worst year, but as the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. The word beginning is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. 536 gets the headline because it is the year the sun went out and the writers noticed. But 536 is the opening, not the whole piece. Because when you take a society that lives on thin margins, and you knock it down, and then knock it down again just as it is standing up, and then knock it down a third time, something changes that does not change with a single blow. The thing does not bounce back. It settles into a new and lower shape. Whole systems of trade and farming and settlement, which had absorbed bad years for centuries, simply stopped absorbing. And the cold, meanwhile, did not lift for over a century. Researchers now speak of a whole cold epoch beginning here, the late antique Little Ice Age, running from 520 years. 120 years, longer than any life in that world. A child born in the grey would grow old and die in a world still colder than the one their grandparents had been born into, and their grandchildren would still not have seen it end. As one historian put it, if you were a carefree young person in the summer of 535, you would have to live to be 100 or so to see the world return to the conditions you remembered from childhood, and almost nobody lived to 100. So for practically everyone alive on the day the sun went dim, the answer to the question, when will things be normal again, was, in truth, never. Not in your lifetime, not in your children's. Let that long chain of blows and the century of cold that followed settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the last and worst of the visitors, the one that came in 541, when the world was already on its knees. In 541, the plague came. I am going to handle this gently and briefly, and I want to tell you in advance exactly how, so that you can relax into it rather than brace against it. I am not going to describe symptoms. I am not going to describe the dying. This is a sleep story, and there are places we do not go, and that is one of them. What I am going to tell you is what it was, where it came from, and the strange and genuinely interesting question of whether the dark sky helped bring it. It arrived at a Roman port in Egypt, a place called Pelusium, and from there it moved, because ports are where the world touches itself. It went out along the grain ships and the trade routes, into the great cities, into Constantinople itself, and it went fast. It came to be called the Plague of Justinian, after the emperor who was unlucky enough to be on the throne when it landed, and who caught it himself, and, remarkably, survived. It was bubonic plague. It was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, and if that name rings a faint bell, it should, because it is the very same organism that would return 800 years later and be given a more famous name, the Black Death. So this was the first of the great plagues. The dress rehearsal, if you like, for the more famous one. And the numbers, though we argue about them, and should be careful with them, are staggering by any reckoning. It may have killed a third to a half of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire. Across the Mediterranean world, the toll may have reached tens of millions. In southern Europe, it appears to have been every bit as brutal as the Black Death would be later. It very likely reached the north as well, into a Scandinavia already emptied by the Great Winter, though there nobody was writing anything down, so we see it only in the silence of abandoned farms. Now, the interesting question, and the one that connects it to our story, was the plague part of this? Or did it simply happen to arrive at the worst imaginable moment, a separate misfortune stacked on top? The honest answer is that we are not certain, and anyone who tells you otherwise is going beyond the evidence. But there are threads. The most obvious is the simplest, which is that hungry people get sick. A population that has been living on short rations for 5 years, that has eaten its animals and its seed corn, that is cold and weakened and crowded together, is a population with very little left to fight with. Whatever arrived was going to find easier work than it would have found in 535. There are subtler ideas too. Some researchers point out that plague lives in fleas and in rodents, and that fleas and rodents care a great deal about temperature and moisture, and that a sudden lurch in the climate can shake that whole delicate arrangement, sending infected rodents out of their usual ranges and into human places, changing how the fleas behave and feed. Change the weather across an entire hemisphere for a decade, and you have shuffled the deck for every small creature on it. Something was always going to fall out differently. So the shape of the thing, as best we can see it, is this. The sky darkens. The harvests fail. The world grows cold and hungry and thin. And then, 5 years into that weakened and exhausted world, walks the worst disease humanity had yet met. It is not that the volcano caused the plague. It is that the volcano prepared the ground for it. And then the plague walked onto that ground and found it soft. That is the last of the darkness, and I am going to leave it there without another word about it. We are done with the worst of the story. Everything from here on gets slowly, steadily better, all the way to your warm bed and the sun that will be there tomorrow. Let that hard chapter close now, and let it settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man on a throne, watching his life's work come apart, and to the strange lesson in it. Spare a thought, tonight, for Justinian, because he had the worst run of luck of any ruler in history, and he did not deserve most of it. Understand what he was trying to do. He had come to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire with an enormous and rather magnificent idea, which was to put the Roman world back together. The western half had fallen apart in the previous century, gone to pieces under the pressure of migration and war, and Justinian looked at that and decided, essentially, no. He would take it back. He would reconquer the lost provinces, restore the empire to its old shape, and make Rome whole again. And he was doing it. His generals were winning. He had taken back North Africa. He was fighting his way up through Italy. He was rewriting the entire body of Roman law into a single code that would go on to shape the legal systems of half the world. He was building the great church of Hagia Sophia, which still stands, and which is still one of the most astonishing buildings human beings have ever put up. And then the sun went out, and then the harvests failed, and the taxes could not be collected, because you cannot tax a farmer who has nothing. And then his armies in Italy had to be fed and paid out of a treasury that was emptying. And then, in 541, the plague came, and killed a huge portion of the people whose taxes paid for the whole magnificent project, and killed the soldiers, and killed the farmers who fed the soldiers, and very nearly killed Justinian himself. His great restoration ground to a halt. The reconquest of Italy dragged on for years, ruinous and inconclusive, chewing up the very country it was meant to save. The empire he had been rebuilding never had the strength to hold what he took, and much of it slipped away again after his death. Procopius, who is writing all this down, and who was there, and who watched it happen, has that grim line about how from the time this thing happened, men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death. And here is the thought I want to leave with you, gently as you drift. Justinian was one of the most powerful people who has ever lived. He commanded armies, wrote laws that outlived his civilization, and built a building that has stood for 1,500 years and is still standing tonight. And all of it was undone, or nearly, by a volcano he never heard of, in a country he did not know existed, that had erupted before he could do anything about it, for reasons no one on earth would understand for another millennium and a half. There is no lesson in that exactly. It is not a moral, it is just the plain shape of the world, and it is oddly restful to look at from a safe distance of 15 centuries. The most powerful man alive, undone by weather, the greatest plans of the greatest people, sitting downstream of the sky. It puts one's own troubles into a certain perspective, I find, in a way that is not depressing at all, but actually rather freeing. So much of everything is simply the sky. So much of it was never ours to control. And knowing that, oddly, makes it easier to set the day down and sleep. Let that ruined emperor and his interrupted dream settle gently in the dark. We turn now, finally, out of the darkness and toward the light, because we are done with the year now, and we are going to go and solve it. So that is the year. That is what happened, as far as the people who lived it could tell. And then they died, and their children died, and their grandchildren, and the story came apart into pieces the way stories do. The Norse kept theirs as a myth about the end of the world. The Irish monks kept theirs as 4 words in a ledger. Procopius and Cassiodorus went into libraries and were copied and recopied by scribes who had no idea what they were describing, and then sat on shelves for 1,000 years. The gold sat in the bogs, the thin rings sat inside the trees, and the trees fell down and were buried and preserved in peat and rivers. And the dust that had done it all drifted slowly down out of the sky over years and settled on everything. And some of it settled on glaciers and got covered by the next winter's snow, and was pressed down and forgotten. And for about 1,400 years, that was that. If you had asked a historian in 1900 what happened in 536, they would have known there was something odd in the sources, some strange business about a fog and a dim sun, and they would have shrugged. Ancient writers say strange things. Perhaps it was a portent they invented for literary effect. Perhaps it was a bad winter that got exaggerated. Perhaps it was a dust storm. There was no way to know, and no obvious way to find out, because the only evidence was a handful of old texts written by men who were describing something they did not understand, in a language of portents and omens, 1,500 years ago. It was a locked room, the strangest kind of historical mystery, where you have the testimony but no way to check it. The witnesses are all long dead, and none of them can tell you anything more than they already wrote, and what they wrote is impossible. And this is where our story turns, and where it becomes, I think, genuinely wonderful, because in the last few decades, human beings have got very good at doing something that would have seemed like sorcery to Procopius. We have learned how to make the world testify. We have learned that you do not actually need a witness who can write, because the trees were watching, and the ice was watching, and neither of them ever forgot a thing, and both of them kept their records in a language we have finally learned to read. The people of 536 could not tell us what happened to them, so we went and asked the planet instead. Let that locked room and its 1,400 years of silence settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the first witness we learn to question, the trees. The trees were the first to talk. Here is how it works, and it is one of those pieces of science so simple and so elegant that it feels like a trick. A tree grows a new layer of wood every year, all the way around, just under the bark. In a good year, warm, wet, plenty of sun, it grows a lot, and the ring is wide. In a bad year, cold, dark, dry, it grows very little, and the ring is narrow. So a tree trunk is a bar chart of the weather, 1 bar per year, going back as long as the tree has been alive. And the tree cannot lie and cannot forget, and does not have opinions. Better still, all the trees in a region experience the same weather, so they all make the same pattern of wide and narrow rings, which means you can match them up. And if you can match a living tree to an old dead beam in a barn, and that beam to an older log dug out of a bog, and that log to a piece of ancient timber from an archaeological dig, you can chain them together, overlapping pattern to overlapping pattern, and walk the record back thousands of years. Scientists have done exactly this, patiently, across the world, and the result is a continuous year-by-year record of the climate reaching back into deep prehistory. And back in the 1990s, people looking at these records noticed something. Around the year 536, something happens to the trees. Everywhere, the rings go narrow, not slightly narrow, dramatically narrow, and not in one forest but across whole continents, and not for 1 year but for years running, with the decade that follows coming out as the coldest summers in 2,000 years. Some rings show frost damage in the middle of the growing season, which is a tree's way of writing down that it froze in July. So now, the strange old texts are not strange anymore, they are corroborated. Procopius says the sun went dim and the world went cold, and the trees, which never read Procopius, say yes, in the same year, in the same decade, that is exactly what happened, and here is how cold, and here is how long. 2 completely independent witnesses, 1 human and 1 wooden, and they agree. This is the moment 536 stopped being a curiosity in an old book and became a real event with a real magnitude that could be measured. And it immediately raised the question that would take another 25 years to answer, and that is the question we are going to spend the rest of our night on. Something cooled the entire northern hemisphere for years. Something put a veil across the whole sky. The trees can tell us that it happened, and when, and how hard, but the trees cannot tell us what it was. For that, we need a witness that did not just feel the event, but caught a piece of it. Let those thin rings and the trees quietly agreeing with Procopius across 15 centuries settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the greatest witness of all, and the strangest library on earth, the ice. Somewhere above you, right now, snow is not falling, but in the high cold places of the world it is, and it has been, every year, for a very long time, and something remarkable happens to it there. In the middle of Greenland, and on the high glaciers of the Alps, and in Antarctica, the snow that falls does not melt, it just sits there, and the next year, more snow falls on top of it, and the year after, more. And the weight of all that snow presses the older snow underneath into ice, and the ice gets deeper and deeper, and it keeps every layer in order, 1 year at a time, going down and down, oldest at the bottom, like the pages of a book that has been being written continuously for tens of thousands of years and never once been shuffled. And here is the part that turns it from a curiosity into a library. Snow does not fall clean. Snow falls through the air, and it catches whatever is in the air on the way down, and brings it with it, and locks it in. So every layer of that ice contains a sample of the sky from the year it fell, dust from a desert storm, salt from a rough sea, pollen, soot, And most importantly for us tonight, sulfur and ash and tiny fragments of volcanic glass. Do you see what that means? It means that when a volcano erupts anywhere on Earth and throws its guts into the stratosphere, and that material spreads out around the hemisphere and hangs there, some of it eventually comes down. And some of what comes down lands on a glacier, and it gets snowed on and pressed and preserved, and it sits there, patiently, in its correct year, for as long as the ice lasts. Which means the ice was there in 536. The ice was standing outside, that whole strange year, with its face turned up, catching everything that fell out of that darkened sky. Every particle of the veil that ruined the world, that starved Ireland and emptied Norway and stopped Justinian. Some tiny sample of it drifted down onto the high, cold snow and was filed away in the correct year and has been sitting there, waiting, ever since. Nobody had to write anything down. Nobody had to survive. Nobody had to understand what they were seeing. The ice just took the notes, automatically, without being asked, and kept them, all through the 1400 years while nobody came, until finally, in our own time, somebody came with a drill. Let that great patient library of snow, holding its notes on the year the sun went out, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the people who went and read it. In 2013, on a glacier called Colle Gnifeti, high in the Swiss Alps, a team drilled a hole in the ice and pulled out a core. I love the plainness of that sentence, and I want you to picture the scene properly, because it is a wonderful image to drift on. Up on the roof of Europe, in the thin, freezing air, a small group of people with a drill, boring down through the ice, and pulling up a long cylinder of it, section by section, until they had 72 meters of it. 72 meters, about the height of a 20-story building, laid out in pieces, made of frozen sky, and in those 72 meters was more than 2,000 years, in order, uninterrupted. Every Saharan dust storm that had ever blown over the Alps, every volcano that had ever reached the stratosphere, every furnace and every smelter that Europeans had ever lit, from the Romans onward, was in there, in its proper layer, in its proper year, because Colle Gnifeti sits right in the middle of Europe and catches everything Europe does. Now, the problem with ice this old is that it is squashed. Down at the bottom, the weight of everything above has pressed the years thin. A whole year of snowfall in the deep 6th century layers is a sliver. To read it, you would have to sample it in slices finer than a year, which for a long time was simply not possible. You could see that something volcanic had happened somewhere around then, but you could not pin it down, and the dating drifted by years or even decades, which is useless when you are trying to match it to a specific harvest failure in a specific spring. So they used a laser. This is the part I find rather beautiful. A team led by the glaciologist Paul Majewski at the University of Maine, working with the Harvard historian Michael McCormick, used an ultra-high-resolution laser system that shaves the ice into slivers 120 microns thick. 120 microns. That is thinner than a sheet of paper. That is thin enough that each sliver represents not a year, not a season, but a matter of days or weeks of ancient snowfall, and each sliver can then be analyzed for what is in it. And with that, suddenly, everything sharpens. Suddenly you are not saying there was a volcano sometime around the 530s. You are saying there was a volcano and its dust arrived here, and it arrived in this season of this year, and here is the sulfur, and here is exactly how much. You can date an event 1,500 years old to within a month. In a tube of ice, pulled out of a mountain, 1,500 years after Procopius sat in Constantinople and wrote, in bafflement, that a most dread portent had taken place. A group of people in a laboratory pointed a laser at a piece of frozen snow and read the portent's name. Let that long cylinder of frozen sky, and the laser slicing it into weeks settled gently in the dark. We turn now to the suspects, because before they found the answer, they had to work their way through a list of the wrong ones. Before we get to the answer, I want to tell you about the wrong answers, because a good mystery deserves its false leads, and because the wrong answers were all perfectly reasonable. Everyone agreed once the tree rings came in that something had put a veil in the sky. The argument was about what. The obvious suspect was a volcano, and that was the leading theory for a long time. But volcano is not an answer. Volcano is a category. There are a great many volcanoes on this earth, and most of them were not doing anything in particular in 536. And the ones that were are mostly not written down anywhere, because the places they sit had no one to write. So which one? Where? The suspect was a mountain, somewhere on a planet full of mountains, and the crime was 1500 years cold. For a while, the evidence pointed to North America. When Michael Sigel and his colleagues at Bern went through the polar ice and lined up the cold snaps of the last 2,500 years against volcanic signals, they found the fingerprint of an enormous eruption in late 535 or early 536, and the pattern of it, the way the sulfur was distributed between the northern and southern ice, suggested it had happened somewhere in the north, perhaps in North America. That was the working theory, somewhere across the Atlantic, in a place with no cities and no chroniclers. A mountain had gone up, and nobody had been there to see it. And then there was the other theory, the exciting one, and I have a soft spot for it, even though it did not survive. Some researchers, notably the geologist Dallas Abbott, looked at material in the Greenland ice and argued for something from space, a comet or an asteroid, coming in and striking the ocean, throwing up an immense quantity of dust and water vapor. It has a certain drama to it, and it is not a silly idea, because things do fall out of the sky and they have ruined the weather before. But it had problems. An ocean strike big enough to darken the world should have produced tsunamis, and nobody in that very literate century recorded any tsunamis. And dust from an impact does not obviously produce the specific effects that were described, the strange blue tint, the long, slow year and a half of dimming, the sulfur signature. The evidence just did not line up. So the field narrowed, the way fields do. Not a comet. A volcano. Not the Mediterranean, where somebody would have written it down. Somewhere north, somewhere empty, somewhere with nobody around to notice. And this is the point where you have to stop reasoning and go and get physical evidence, because reasoning has taken you as far as it can. You can argue about distribution patterns forever. What you need is a piece of the thing itself. You need the mountain to have left something behind, a fragment, a fleck. Anything that came out of that specific mountain on that specific morning and travelled across the world and landed somewhere it would be kept. Which is exactly why the alpine ice mattered so much, and why the laser mattered so much, because that is where the fragment was. It had been sitting there, in the dark, under 1400 years of snow. The whole time everyone was arguing about North America and comets. The answer was already in the building. It just needed somebody to slice the building thinly enough to find it. Let those wrong suspects and the narrowing hunt settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what they actually found in the layer marked 536, which is the answer to our whole long mystery, and which comes down, in the end, to 2 specks of dust. In the part of the core that corresponds to the spring of 536, they found 2 microscopic particles of volcanic glass. That is it. That is the whole answer. 2 specks, each one far too small to see. 1500 years old, drifted out of a poisoned sky onto a mountain, buried under 14 centuries of snow, and found. Now, here is why 2 specks of glass are enough, and this is the loveliest part of the whole story. Volcanic glass is not generic. When a volcano erupts, the molten rock it throws out has a particular chemical signature, a specific recipe of elements that reflects the particular geology of the particular place it came from. Iceland's rock is not Italy's rock, is not Alaska's rock. So a fragment of volcanic glass is not just evidence that a volcano went off. It is a fingerprint. It carries, locked into its chemistry, the identity of the mountain that made it. So they analyzed the composition of those two specks, and they compared it to volcanic rocks from around the world, and it matched Iceland. Iceland. A cataclysmic volcanic eruption in Iceland, early in 536, throwing an enormous quantity of ash and sulfur high into the stratosphere, where the great winds took it and spread it in a veil right around the northern hemisphere, and that veil hung there and dimmed the sun and cooled the world and failed the harvests and starved Ireland and emptied Norway and stopped an emperor's dream and gave the North a myth about the end of the world. And the same core showed the rest of it too, exactly as the story required. Another massive eruption in 540, another in 547. The three blows, right there in the ice, in the right years, in the right order. I want you to hold the shape of this for a moment, because it is one of the great detective stories, and it deserves a moment before you drift off. A man in Constantinople in 536 writes down that the sun has gone dim and he does not know why. He dies not knowing. Everyone who reads him for 1400 years does not know. The trees know that something happened but cannot say what. And then, in our own lifetime, on a mountain in Switzerland, two invisible pieces of glass are pulled out of a tube of ancient snow, and a laboratory looks at their chemistry and says, quietly, Iceland, spring, 536. The witnesses were all dead. The murder weapon was found anyway. 15 centuries later, in a piece of frozen sky, let those two invisible specks and the mountain they came from settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the volcano itself and to what it actually does to a planet, so that you can see, clearly and calmly, exactly how a mountain in the North Atlantic reached across the world and turned out the lights. Let us go and stand, safely and imaginatively, in Iceland, early in the year 536, and watch the thing happen. And then let us follow what it made, all the way up into the sky and out around the world, because the mechanism is genuinely fascinating and oddly rather soothing to follow, the way any well-made machine is soothing to watch. Iceland sits on a seam. The great plates of the Earth's crust are pulling apart there, and the molten rock beneath comes up to fill the gap, which is why the island exists at all, and why it is so extravagantly volcanic. When one of these volcanoes goes, it can go on a scale that has no equivalent in ordinary human experience. Not a cone politely puffing smoke, a tear in the ground, kilometers long, with the inside of the planet coming out of it. Now, the thing that matters for our story is not the lava. Lava is local. Lava ruins whatever is next to it and then stops. The thing that matters is what goes up. An eruption of this size throws an immense column of material straight up, and if it is violent enough, that column punches all the way through the layer of the atmosphere we live in, the troposphere, where the weather happens, and up into the layer above it, the stratosphere. And that is the whole game right there. That crossing is everything. Because in the troposphere, things get washed out. Dust and ash and smoke go up, and the weather takes hold of them, and it rains, and the rain scrubs the sky clean, and in a few weeks it is gone. That is why an ordinary eruption is a regional problem. The sky cleans itself. But there is no weather in the stratosphere. There is no rain up there. Nothing gets washed out. Anything you put into the stratosphere stays in the stratosphere for a very long time, and the winds up there are enormous and they run right around the planet. So whatever you put in gets smeared out into a thin sheet across an entire hemisphere and hangs there like a lid. And it is not really the ash that does the damage. It is the sulfur. A volcano throws out vast quantities of sulfur dioxide, And once that is up in the stratosphere, it reacts and turns into tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, an aerosol, a haze of microscopic bright droplets. And these droplets are very good at one particular thing, which is bouncing sunlight back out into space before it ever reaches the ground. That is the whole mechanism. That is how you turn out the sun. You do not block it. You do not put a shutter over it. You put a fine bright haze in front of it, high up, where the rain cannot reach, and that haze quietly reflects a percentage of the incoming light back where it came from. And so the light that gets through is dimmer, and it is scattered, so it comes from everywhere at once instead of from one point, which is why there were no shadows at noon, and it has been filtered so it looks strange and wrong in colour, which is why Cassiodorus wrote that the sun had turned a bluish colour. And crucially, the heat does not arrive, because the heat was in the light, and the light went back to space, and so the temperature falls across the whole hemisphere for as long as the veil hangs there. Everything the witnesses described, every single detail, falls straight out of that one mechanism. The dim sun you could look at, the missing shadows, the wrong colour, the cold that would not lift, the winter without storms, the spring without mildness, the summer without heat. All of it, every word, is just what it looks like from underneath, when a mountain in the North Atlantic puts a veil of acid droplets between you and the star you live on. Let that great column of sulphur and ash, and the veil it made, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the people who worked all of this out, and to the rather wonderful way that history and science had to hold hands to do it. I want to spend a little time on the people who solved this, because the solving of it is a lovely human story in its own right, and because it says something rather hopeful about what we can do when we bother. The trouble with a mystery like 536 is that it does not belong to anybody. It is too old for the scientists and too physical for the historians. A climate scientist can measure a volcanic signal in an ice core with great precision and have no idea what it did to anybody, because that is not their field. A historian can read Procopius and Cassiodorus and the Irish annals in the original and know exactly what people said and suffered, and have no way whatever to work out what caused it, because that is not their field either. For most of the 20th century, these two groups of people were sitting in different buildings, holding two halves of the same answer. So the breakthrough, when it came from people who crossed over. There is Michael McCormick, a historian and archaeologist at Harvard, who is exactly the sort of historian who wants to know what the ice says. He is the one who gave us the line that has followed this year around ever since, that 536 was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. There is Paul Majewski, a glaciologist at the University of Maine, who has spent his career reading ice. There is Michael Sigel and his colleagues at Bern, who in 2015 did an extraordinary piece of work, going through the ice records and lining up nearly every significant cold snap of the last 2,500 years against volcanic eruptions, and finding that they matched, again and again, and pinning down a major eruption in late 535 or early 536, followed by another in 540. There is Andrei Kurbatov, the volcanologist who could say that the laser method let them date storms and eruptions and pollution to within a month or less across 2,000 years. There is Christopher Lovelock, an archaeologist at Nottingham, who will matter very much in our next chapter. There is Kyle Harper, a Roman historian, who said that the ice gives us a new kind of record for understanding how human and natural causes tangled together at the end of the Roman world. Look at that list. A historian, a glaciologist, a volcanologist, an archaeologist, a geochemist with a laser. Not one of them could have done this alone. The historian without the ice has a strange story and no cause. The glaciologist without the history has a sulfur spike in a graph and no idea that it emptied Norway and gave the world Ragnarok. It is only when you put the two next to each other when somebody carries the ice core into the room where the Latin is, that the whole thing suddenly stands up and becomes the greatest disaster in human history. And I find that genuinely moving, in a quiet way. Procopius wrote his few bewildered sentences in the hope, I suppose, that somebody someday would read them. He could not have imagined who. He could not have imagined that the person who finally understood what he had seen would be sitting in a laboratory 1500 years later, holding a sliver of Swiss glacier thinner than a hair, and would look up and say, "Oh, he was telling the truth. It really did look like the moon." Let those patient detectives, carrying their two halves of the answer toward each other across 15 centuries, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the very best thing in the whole ice core, which is not the disaster at all, but the recovery. Here is my favorite fact in this entire story, and I have been saving it for you. The same ice core that recorded the catastrophe also recorded the healing, and the way it did it is so unexpected and so clever that when I first understood it, I had to sit down. Remember that the ice catches everything in the air, not just volcanic dust. It also catches pollution. And one of the things human beings put into the air, when they are busy and prosperous and making things, is lead. Because to get silver, you smelt it out of lead ore, and smelting throws lead into the sky, and the sky carries it to the glacier, and the glacier writes it down. So lead in the ice means silver mining. And silver mining means somebody wants silver. And somebody wanting silver means there is trade, and there is money, and there are merchants, and there is enough spare energy in the world for people to be digging metal out of the ground and turning it into coins instead of just desperately trying to grow enough food to survive the winter. Lead in the ice, in other words, is a heartbeat. It is a measure of whether the economy is alive. And so you can read the whole thing, straight off the core, like a chart of the patient's condition. There is the sulfur of 536. There is the sulfur of 540. There is the sulfur of 547. And through all of that, and for a long time afterward, the lead is flat. The heartbeat is faint. Decade after decade, the world is not smelting, not mining, not trading, not making. Europe is in a deep economic stagnation, and the ice can see it, year by year, in the amount of lead not arriving. For 100 years, the graph just lies there. And then, in the year 640, the lead comes back. There it is, in the ice. A spike. A rise in airborne lead, which means silver being smelted again, which means demand, which means somebody out there wants money, because there is something to buy and someone to buy it from. The archaeologist Christopher Lovelock and his colleagues, who published this, read it exactly that way, as a sign of an economy at last rebounding from the blow of a century before. And then a second peak, in 660, a real infusion of silver into the new medieval economy, which Lovelock suggests shows something remarkable, the rise of a merchant class, for the first time. Do you understand what that means? It means that 100 years after the sun went out, somewhere in Europe, somebody lit a furnace to smelt silver, and the smoke went up and drifted north and east, and a few atoms of lead from that furnace fell on a glacier in the Alps and were covered by snow, and stayed there for 1300 years, until somebody drilled them out and read them and understood that they meant the world had started living again. That is what recovery looks like from 1500 years away. Not a battle, not a coronation, not a treaty. A trace of metal in ice, meaning that somewhere down below the clouds, the ordinary machinery of ordinary human life had quietly started turning again. Let that little spike of lead, and the world it means, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange new world that grew up in the ruins, and to the ways in which the year 536 is still standing all around you. Something has to fill an empty space. When you knock a world down and it does not get up again in the same shape, something else grows in the gap. And the something else that grew in this particular gap is, more or less, the world we are still living in. I want to be careful here, and I want to flag that carefulness clearly, because this is the part of the story where it is very easy to get carried away. There is a whole genre of writing that takes 536 and hangs absolutely everything on it, that says, this one volcano caused the rise of Islam and the fall of the Sassanids and the collapse of the Gupta Empire and the end of Teotihuacan and the migration of the Mongols and the coming of the Middle Ages, all in one great tidy chain. And that is too much. History is not a row of dominoes, and any story that explains everything with one cause is usually explaining nothing at all. Serious historians are much more cautious, and so should we be, lying here in the dark being sensible. But the careful version is remarkable enough on its own, and it goes like this. The Eastern Roman Empire survived, but it was gutted. Justinian's dream of restoring Rome was over. The empire that came out of the 6th century was smaller, poorer, and thinner in people than the one that went in, and it never again had the strength to be what it had been. And that mattered enormously, because for centuries that empire had been the great weight on one side of the scales in that part of the world. Take a third or a half of its people away, empty its treasury, and exhaust its armies, and the balance of the whole region shifts. Things become possible that were not possible before. In the West, the old Roman world had already been coming apart, and this finished the job. The long trade routes that had carried grain and oil and wine across the Mediterranean thinned out. Cities shrank. People pulled back onto the land. The economy stopped being a great connected web and became a patchwork of small local worlds that fed themselves and did not travel much. That is, in a sentence, the arrival of the early medieval world. It did not arrive because a volcano told it to, but the volcano and the cold century after it and the plague gave that shift an almighty push. And in the north, where the population had collapsed, whole societies reorganized themselves out of the wreckage. New elites rose from the emptiness. New myths were told. The Scandinavia that comes out the other side of this, that will eventually give us the Viking Age, is a place that has been through the fire and rebuilt itself into something different from what went before. So the fair claim is not that 5036 caused the modern world. The fair claim is smaller and, I think, more interesting. It is that 536 was an enormous shove delivered to a world that was already leaning, and that a good deal of what came afterward came down the path that the shove opened. The medieval world grew in the space that the 6th century cleared, and you are, in a small and real way, living downstream of a mountain in Iceland that nobody has ever identified with certainty, that erupted one spring morning 1500 years ago and blotted out the sun. Let that new world, growing quietly in the cleared ground, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a joke that history has been quietly telling for 200 years without realizing it. There is an irony sitting in the middle of this story so neat that if you put it in a novel, your editor would take it out for being too much. For a very long time, historians called this period the Dark Ages. You know the phrase. It covers roughly the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and it was meant as an insult, or at least as a complaint. The scholars who coined it did not mean that the sky was dark. They meant that the records were dark. They meant that after the bright, well-documented centuries of Rome, with its libraries and its letters and its historians, you come into a stretch of time where the writing thins out and the sources go quiet, and we cannot see very well what was happening. Dark, as in we cannot see. Dark, as in the lights are off in the archive. Historians have spent the last century backing away from the term, and rightly so, because it turned out to be unfair. That world was not a barbaric void. It was making things and thinking things and building things, and the darkness was largely in our own knowledge, rather than in their lives. Almost nobody who studies the period seriously uses the phrase anymore without an apology attached. And yet it turns out that right at the front of it, At the very beginning of the stretch that got called the Dark Ages, the sun genuinely went out for 18 months. The scholars who picked that name were reaching for a metaphor about the state of the paperwork, and they accidentally, blindly, described the literal weather. The Dark Age began in the dark. It began with a sky that had a lid on it, and a sun you could look at like the moon. Nobody planned that. Nobody knew. The people who invented the term had no access to tree rings or ice cores, and would have been astonished to learn that their tidy, dismissive little label was, for a few years at the start, a plain description of the light levels. And it goes a step further, into stranger country. There is a thought, and I offer it as a thought rather than a fact, that some of the great legends of Britain may have their roots in this same darkness. The stories of a warlord holding a broken country together, of wars and migrations and a kingdom collapsing into myth, of a golden age lost, the whole tangle that would eventually be polished over centuries into the legend of King Arthur, sits chronologically right on top of this crisis. Some historians have suggested that the upheaval of the late 530s, the failing harvests, the movements of hungry, desperate people, the collapse of order, is part of the raw material that later became that legend. It is speculative. It may well be wrong, but it is a lovely thought, and it belongs to the same family as the Fimbulwinter. The idea that when something too big to understand happens to people who cannot write it down, it does not vanish. It goes into stories. It turns into gods and wolves and kings and a great winter and a sword in a stone. So we have a period named for a darkness the namers did not know was real, containing myths about the end of the world that may be memories of a real end of a real world, all sitting on top of a volcano nobody would identify for 1500 years. History is not usually that tidy. It is rather nice when it is. Let that accidental joke and the legends that may be memories settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the saddest and most tender thought in the whole story, which is about what none of them ever got to know. Here is the thought that I keep coming back to, and I offer it to you now as the night deepens, because it is a soft and human thing to hold as you drift. Not one of them ever found out. Procopius died not knowing. He wrote his careful sentences about the sun like the moon, and he clearly wanted an explanation. You can feel him reaching for one, and he never got it. Cassiodorus died not knowing, having written the most precise description of the whole event that anybody would produce for 1,000 years, and never learning what he had described. The Irish monks died not knowing why the bread had failed for 4 years running. The farmers of Norway died not knowing why the summers had stopped coming. The people who carried their gold out to the bogs and gave it to the water died believing they had failed to please a god, when in fact they had simply been standing under a chemical veil that no offering in the world could have shifted. The entire generation that lived through the worst year in human history went into their graves with the mystery unsolved. Every last one of them, and their children and their children's children, and every human being for 50 generations after them. And then, 1,500 years later, a laser and a piece of Swiss ice. There is something in that which I find almost unbearably poignant, but not in a sad way, in a kind of warm way, because we did find out. Late, far too late to be of any use to a single one of them, but we did. Somebody eventually cared enough to go and look. Somebody dragged a drill up a mountain and shaved a piece of frozen snow into slices thinner than paper and asked the sky what had happened, and the sky told them, and now we know. The mystery that Procopius could not solve, that he did not have the faintest chance of solving, that he wrote down anyway because he thought it mattered and someone should have a record, that mystery is solved. His testimony was good, it was accurate, it held up. 1,500 years later, it was checked against the physical evidence, and it passed. He was believed in the end. That is not nothing. That is, I think, one of the loveliest things people do for each other across time. He wrote it down for us without knowing who we would be, and we went and did the work and found out he had been telling the truth. Nobody got to tell him, but it happened. Let that long silence, and the answer that came too late for anyone who needed it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, at last, toward home, and toward you, and toward the extraordinary fact of the ordinary night you are lying in. So let us come back now, out of the 6th century, up through the long centuries, and back to your bed, where it is warm, and where the sun has been perfectly well behaved all day. You did not wake up in the year 536. I want to say that plainly, because we have spent a couple of hours in that year, and it is worth pausing on the enormous good fortune of not being there. But I do not want to leave it as a simple congratulation, because the more interesting question is why. Why is the year 536 not possible for you in the same way? Not because volcanoes have stopped. They have not. Iceland is still there, still sitting on its seam, still doing what it does. The Earth has not been retired from the business of erupting. The reason is that almost everything about the arrangement you live in has changed, and it changed in exactly the places where those people were vulnerable. You are not living on one field. That is the big one. The person in 536 ate what grew within walking distance, and if that failed, there was no alternative, because there was no way to move food at scale. You eat food from everywhere. If a harvest fails on one continent, food comes from another. That is the single greatest difference, and it is worth appreciating because it is the thing that turned crop failure from a death sentence into a price rise. You have a store, not you personally perhaps, but the world does. There are reserves, granaries, warehouses, stockpiles, months and months of buffer built into the system, because we have learned, expensively, that buffers are what keep people alive. And most importantly, and this is the one that matters most to me, you would know. If a volcano in Iceland put a veil across the sky next spring, we would know within hours. We would know which volcano, and how big, and how much sulfur, and we would be able to model what it would do to the temperature and the harvests, and roughly for how long. We would be frightened, I am sure, and it would be a serious and expensive and difficult thing. But nobody would think the gods were angry. Nobody would carry their wedding ring out to a bog and give it to the water in the hope of buying back the light. Nobody would grow old and die in bewilderment. We would know what it was on the first day, and we would know it would pass, and we would tell each other so. That is the gift, really. Not the technology exactly. The knowing. The people of 536 suffered the darkness, and on top of the darkness they suffered the not knowing, and I think the not knowing may have been the heavier of the two. To be inside a catastrophe with no name for it, no cause for it, no end promised for it, is a particular kind of loneliness that we, tonight, are very largely spared. We inherited that from them, in a way. They asked the question, we finally got the answer, and the answer is now just sitting there, freely available, for anybody who wants it, which is a thing so extraordinary that we have completely stopped noticing it. Let that great gulf between their darkness and your warm and well-lit night settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the gentlest question of all, and then to sleep. I know, the question has been sitting there for the last hour, and it would be strange of me to spend all night telling you about the sky going out, and then simply not mention it. So let us take it out and look at it calmly, and then put it away, because the answer is much gentler than you might expect. Yes, in the sense that volcanoes have not gone anywhere. The plates still move. Iceland still sits on its seam. Somewhere, on some morning, a mountain will do this again, because that is what mountains do, and it will not ask us first. The Earth has been erupting for 4.5 billion years, and it is not going to stop because we would find it inconvenient. And no, in the sense that almost nothing else about the situation is the same. Consider what actually killed people in 536. It was not the darkness. Darkness does not kill anyone. What killed people was that the darkness reduced the harvest, and the harvest was the only food, and there was no other food anywhere, and there was no way to move food from anywhere to anywhere, and there was no store to draw on, and nobody knew it was coming, and nobody knew when it would end, and so they had no way to plan, ration, or hope. Every single link in that chain has since been cut. We would see the eruption from space as it happened. We would measure the sulfur going into the stratosphere within days. We would model the temperature effect within weeks. And we would have a fair estimate of the size of the harvest problem before a single seed went into the ground. We would move food. We would draw on stores. We would argue about it enormously and handle it imperfectly, because that is what we are like. But the fundamental machinery of a modern world is that a bad year in one place is met by a good year in another, and food goes on ships. The person in 536 had one field and no ships. We have the whole planet and a great many ships. And there is the deeper thing, which is the knowing. Whatever else happened, we would not be Cassiodorus, standing in a courtyard, watching the shadows fail, with no idea whether this was the end of the world or a passing strangeness, with no way to tell his children whether the light was coming back. We would know it was coming back, we would know roughly when, and that knowledge, which cost 1,500 years and a great deal of patient work by people with drills and lasers and Latin dictionaries to acquire, is now simply ours, permanently, for free. So the honest answer to could it happen again is that the sky could dim again, yes, and it would be a hard and serious thing, and it would not be the year 536, because we are not those people anymore, and we are not those people precisely because of what happened to them and what we learned from it, which is, when you think about it, more or less the entire point of history. They went through it, we found out why, and because we found out why, it can never do to us quite what it did to them. That is not nothing, that is in fact the whole inheritance. Now, that is the last hard question of the night, and it is answered, and we can set it down. There is nothing else to worry about. Everything from here to the end is soft. Let that question, asked and answered, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the best moment in the whole story, the morning the light came back. I want you to picture it, because somebody, somewhere, was the first to notice, and nobody wrote it down, and it must have been one of the great small moments in human history. The veil did not lift all at once. That is not how a stratospheric aerosol behaves. It thins. Slowly, over months, the droplets drift down out of the high sky, a little at a time, and the light gets a little better and a little better, so gradually that at first you distrust it, because you have distrusted the light for a year and a half, and you have been disappointed before. But somebody was first. Somebody, on some ordinary morning, in some field, in some valley, straightened up from their work and looked at the ground and saw something that had not been there for 18 months. Their shadow. Not a vague smudge, a shadow, with an edge on it, lying there on the earth, sharp and dark and absolutely ordinary, the way it had lain there every day of their entire life until the year the sky broke. And they would have stood there, I think, and looked down at their own shadow with their heart going, and then they would have looked up and squinted and had to look away, because the sun would have hurt to look at, because the sun was back, because the sun was doing the thing that suns do, which is to be too bright to look at. And then they would have run, to tell someone, to tell everyone. I imagine that news going through a village faster than any news has ever gone through any village, out of the fields and into the houses and out of the houses and back into the fields, people coming out of their doors and standing in the road with their faces turned up, feeling it, warmth, actual warmth on actual skin, after a year and a half of a sun that gave no heat at all, and the colours, the green of the trees coming back to being green, the blue of the sky being blue, all of it flooding back into a world that had been the colour of dishwater since before some of these children could remember. Nobody wrote that morning down. Not one of our writers mentions it, which is such a human thing when you think about it. They wrote down the portent and the dread and the failure of bread, and when it ended, when the thing they had prayed for and buried their gold for actually happened, they were presumably far too busy standing in it and weeping and getting the crop in to make a note. The catastrophe is on the record and the deliverance is not, because nobody sits down to write history on the day the sun comes back. They go outside, and the harvest that year would have been better, and the one after that better still. And the children who had grown up in the grey learned, for the first time, what their grandparents had been going on about, and stood in a proper summer afternoon and understood. Let that first sharp shadow on the earth, and the people running to tell each other, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the same sun, which is going to do the very same thing for you tomorrow morning, entirely for free. Here is what I would like to leave you with, as the night gets deep and your thoughts start to loosen. Tomorrow morning, the sun is going to come up. It is going to clear the horizon and climb, and the light will come through your window, and it will be the ordinary gold light that you have seen every day of your life, and have therefore entirely stopped seeing. You will not notice it. You will get up and think about your day, and the light will simply be there, free, unremarkable, the least interesting thing in the room. And in the year 536, there was a person, exactly as real as you, who would have given every single thing they owned for that. Who did give every single thing they owned for it, in the north, carrying their gold out to the bog in the grey, who stood in their doorway and looked up at a coin of dull silver where the sun should be, and would have traded their house, their land, their name, anything, for one ordinary morning, like the one you are going to get tomorrow and not notice. I am not telling you this to make you feel guilty. That would be a pretty poor way to send someone off to sleep, and anyway, guilt is a useless thing at bedtime. I am telling you because I think it is genuinely lovely, and because it is a good and soft thing to fall asleep holding. You are, tonight, in possession of something that the entire population of the Northern Hemisphere, at the worst moment in human history, prayed for and could not have. You have a sun that works. You have shadows with edges on them. You have a harvest that came in, somewhere, for you, from fields you have never seen, and it will be there in the morning. You have warmth, and you have light, and you have, most extraordinary of all, an explanation for everything freely available, which not one single person in 5T36 had for anything. We spend so much of our lives in a low-grade sense of not quite having enough. It is the water we swim in. And then you look at a farmer in a grey field in 536, doing arithmetic that does not work, under a sun they can stare at, and the ledger looks very different. Almost everything you have, they would have called a miracle, and would not have believed you if you had described it. So that is what I want to leave in your hands as you go under. Not the darkness, not the plague, which we have done with, and will not mention again. Just this. The sun is coming back tomorrow. It comes back every single day. It came back for them, in the end, and they wept in the road about it, and it will come back for you in a few hours, and you will not even notice. And that right there, is what a good life looks like from 1500 years away. Let that ordinary miracle, the sun that will rise for you tomorrow, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, one last time, back to that small village in the grey, to see how the story ends for them, and then we will let it all go. Let us go back to your valley one final time, and let us go a few years on, past the worst of it, and let us look in on it at night. The houses are still there, fewer perhaps than there were. Some of the names are gone, and that is true, and we will not pretend otherwise. And the people who are left carry those names quietly, and will for the rest of their lives. But the valley is still a valley, and the stream still runs, and there is smoke coming through the thatch of the houses that remain, which means there are fires, which means there is fuel, which means somebody had the strength to go and cut wood, which means the worst is over. In the field, the crop is in the ground, and it is greener than it was. Not what it was in the old days, but greener. Enough. And in the byre there is an animal again, a single cow perhaps, which is an enormous thing, which represents somebody's patient decision not to eat it last winter when they very easily could have, because they were thinking about this spring, which means that somebody in this valley had recovered enough to start thinking about the future again. That is what recovery actually is. It is not a feeling. It is somebody, at the very bottom of everything, deciding not to eat the seed corn. And inside the house, it is dark and warm, and the family is asleep. The parents, older than they should be, worn in a way that has not entirely lifted, and perhaps never will. And the children who are growing, and who are fine, and who have already half forgotten, because that is the other great mercy of being human, and it is the last one I have for you tonight. We forget, not the big things, but the texture of them. The children who were small when the sky went grey will grow up and be old people, and they will tell their grandchildren about the great darkness, and their grandchildren will half listen, the way you half listened to your own grandparents, and the story will get shorter and stranger with every telling, until eventually it will be about gods and wolves and a winter at the end of the world. And that family, asleep in the dark, has no idea. They do not know it was Iceland. They do not know it was sulphur. They do not know there were 3 of them, or that there will be 120 years of cold, or that 100 years from now somebody will light a furnace and smelt silver, and the world will finally be alive again. They do not know that in 1500 years a voice will describe their valley to a person lying in a warm bed, in a world so comfortable and so bright that it would look like paradise to them. They just know that the sun came back, and that the crop is in, and that tonight, at least, everyone in this house has eaten something, and the fire is banked, and it is quiet, and they can sleep. That is all any of them ever wanted. That is all any of us ever want, really, underneath everything. A full enough belly, a warm enough room, the people you love breathing in the dark nearby, and the reasonable expectation that the sun will be there in the morning. They got it back, in the end. And you have it right now. Let that quiet valley, and the sleeping family, and the cow that nobody ate, settle gently in the dark. We turn now only towards sleep. The fire is banked, the valley is dark. 1500 years of ice lie between them and you, and every layer of it is in order, and every layer of it is quiet. Think of it, if you like, as you go under. All that snow, falling and settling, and being covered, year after year after year, in the high cold places while everything happened down below. The snow that fell in 536 with the sulphur in it, and then the snow of 537 on top of it, and 538, and 539, and all the years of the long cold, and then the year the sun came back, and then all the years after, quietly stacking. The snow that fell the year the lead came back, and the world started making things again. The snow that fell while the myth of the Fimbulwinter was told and retold and slowly turned into legend. The snow of every year of every century since, falling and settling and pressing down, keeping perfect count, asking nothing, telling no one, until somebody came at last with a drill. It is all still there. It is up there right now, in the dark, above the clouds, in the cold and the silence, holding the whole story in order. And it will go on holding it, whether anyone comes or not. There is something so restful in that. The world remembers everything, patiently, without being asked, and it does not need you to stay awake for it. The ice has kept the 6th century safe for 1500 years without your help. It will manage tonight, so you can let go now, at all of it. The year, and the fog, and the pale sun, and the field, and the gold in the bog, and the 2 specks of glass, and the laser, and the lead. You do not have to hold any of it. It is written down. It is in the ice and it is in the books, and it is safe, and it will still be there tomorrow, and you do not have to carry a single piece of it into your sleep. Let your body grow heavier now. Let it sink down into the warmth, into the softness, into the dark. Your feet and your legs growing heavy. Your hands and your arms resting. Your shoulders sinking. Your breath slow and low and easy, moving all on its own. The sun is on the other side of the world right now, doing exactly what it has always done, and it is coming back around to you, and it will be there in the morning, and there is not the smallest thing you need to do about it. Let all of it, the whole long strange year, and the whole long patient answer, settle gently in the dark. We turn now, only, toward rest. There is nothing more to hear tonight, nothing more to learn, nothing more to hold, nothing to solve. The mystery is solved. It was solved before you ever lay down. 2 specks of glass, in a mountain, in Switzerland, and the whole thing is answered, and you can rest. The valley is asleep, the family is asleep, and the fire is banked, and the cow is in the byre, and the crop is in the ground. The ice is up there in the cold and the dark, keeping its perfect count, and the sun, the ordinary faithful sun, is coming around. Let your body settle, let the last of the day go, let your thoughts loosen and float away, one by one, like snow falling somewhere very high up and very far away, settling softly, layer on layer, in no hurry at all, keeping no count that matters tonight. There is nothing to guard, there is nothing to carry, there is nowhere to be. There is only the warm dark, and the weight of you sinking into it, and the slow, easy movement of your breath, and the quiet. You are safe, you are warm, you are held. The sun will be there in the morning. Good night, traveller. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.